employees. So welcome to the October 2025 meeting of our Renewable Energy Supporter Speaker Series. My name is Len Luca. I'm the Renewables Outreach Coordinator for New Yorkers for Clean Power. Before I announce our speaker, just a reminder, please put your questions in the chat and we'll be pulling them out for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So we're very lucky to have with us today Rebekah Pierce. She's a freelance writer in upstate New York. She and her husband own a farm, J&R Pierce Family Farm, and that it specializes in regenerative agriculture. We're putting that link to the webpage for their farm into the chat right now. Please visit that link. There's some great information there. They raise sheep, pigs, cows, chickens, and turkeys. She's the most media-savvy, first-hand practitioner of agrivoltaics that I know. Her book, Agri-Energy, Growing Power, Growing Food, is due for publication by Island Press in November. I've pre-ordered a copy, and we're putting a link to her book in the chat. It really helps authors to get as many pre-orders as possible. So if you're interested in the presentation and interested in supporting the author and getting the book, please don't be shy about pre-ordering. Okay, Rebekah, we are so lucky to have you here. Thank you so much. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the generous plug of my book. I'm not always good at the shameless promotion, so I appreciate that. Let me see. I'm going to share my screen here because I do have some slides. All right. So hopefully everybody can see that. It's not the fanciest Google Slides, but I did my best for a farm kid here. All right, so as Len mentioned in her very generous introduction, my name is Rebekah Pierce. I am a solar grazer and writer in upstate New York. So just a little bit of background on who I am before I dive into what it is that we do. So we have only been farming for about the last 10 years, and we very much got into this by accident. We purchased our property. We have just under 25 acres in upstate New York. We're in Clinton County, for those of you who might be wondering. We bought our property in 2015 to build our house on. And at the time, really our goal was we wanted something with just enough land for our dog to have space to run around. That was our kind of our sole priority. Shortly after moving in, we realized that we wanted to raise chickens. And I always refer to chickens as the gateway drug, because once you get a couple chickens, everything just goes downhill from there. So after the chickens, we started raising pigs. We started raising meat chickens, and then it led to sheep, and then eventually cattle and pork, and everything kind of spiraled from there. At the time, our family kind of thought we were a little bit crazy. We're first generation farmers, and I'm not actually a huge fan of that term for a lot of reasons. One is because I think farming is really something that should be accessible to anybody, and there shouldn't be this kind of generational requirement for you to farm. But it's important that I call myself that for the context of this conversation, because when we were getting started, we really financed everything ourselves, and we had to learn everything ourselves. And that generational, knowledge that you get from being in a farming family is really important. And as we were getting started, that's something we realized was going to be a challenge for us as we were getting started. So at the time, we were really just raising food for ourselves, and then eventually some local customers, family and friends, and people who had heard about us and who wanted to try, a share of pork or a lamb share, things like that. But around the time of the pandemic, we realized that there was this pretty significant market for local food that wasn't being met. And so things really kind of exploded for us around the time of the pandemic. And we realized that this was something we wanted to explore on a larger scale. The problem with that was at the time we were, as I mentioned, very much self-funding ourselves. So I had started a little side hustle as a freelance writer around the time. My husband and I were both high school teachers. But we both had a dream of being able to leave our teaching jobs and for him to farm full time and for me to pursue my writing business while helping out on the farm. The biggest challenge in expanding our farm was that we needed a lot more land to do it. So the parcel of land we had purchased was pretty wet and not super great for farming. And even if it had been, 25 acres is really not a lot of space when you are trying to raise animals the way we do. So we kind of advertise ourselves as a regenerative farm. And so what that means for us is that we try to not just extract things from the land, but also put something back into it. So we're not just thinking about our yields, we're thinking about how we can support long-term soil health, how we can support biodiversity, how we can really build up build up our environment and build up our land over time rather than just pulling product off of it. And so to do that, you do need a fair amount of land because with livestock, you're going to be moving them frequently and paying very close attention to the impact that they're having on the land. So at the height of the pandemic, I decided to leave teaching, start my writing business full time. My husband was still working multiple jobs as we were trying to keep this farm afloat, which at the time was really more of a hobby farm than anything else. And we started brainstorming. When that happened, we were fortunate enough to be approached by two brothers. They're actually two gentlemen who sell us our hay for our sheep in the wintertime. And they were in the process of putting solar on their land. And they were older, they're in their 70s now. They were ready to get out of farming. And they wanted to see that land remain in agriculture, but they didn't necessarily want to do it themselves. So they approached us with this idea of putting our sheep under their solar panels. This was about 2021, and so solar grazing and agrivoltaics has been around for quite a while, longer than that, obviously. But up here at the time, and really in a lot of places in the United States, it was very much a foreign concept. And so it took quite a bit of convincing on our part. It's not really as risky as you think, and there are benefits and all this back and forth about why a developer and an asset owner might want to pursue it. But eventually we did land that final contract, and it was our first of, I believe, now 7 sites we are grazing across Clinton, Essex, Franklin, and St. Lawrence counties in New York. We currently have around 200 head of Dorper and Katahdin sheep, which are hair sheep, so they shed their coat rather than growing, that thick, heavy fleece. Everybody always thinks they're goats, but they're definitely sheep. You can see in the picture here, it does look very goat-like, but it is a sheep. And so from about April to November every year, we are grazing our sheep on solar farms. They are the primary vegetation management crew, and I will chat a little bit more about that later. The last thing I'll mention for this slide is the reason for writing my book, which may be obvious at this point, but really I wanted to bring awareness to this idea of how renewable energy and agriculture really work so well together. I focus primarily on solar in the book, but I wanted a term that was kind of more all-encompassing than just agrivoltaics, because that obviously refers to farming under solar panels. I wanted to look at all the other ways that agriculture and renewables could work together too, whether that's wind or anything along those lines. So agri-energy is the term that I came up with, and I'm sure somebody else has used it before, so I'm not gonna, take full credit for that or put a copyright on it or anything. But agri-energy is the term that I use because I like that it's more of this broad, overarching term instead of something that's a little bit more restrictive. Oops. You're not advancing. Why would that be? There we go. Cool. All right, so what is agri-energy? And I chose this picture because I really like how it highlights, you have solar panels, you have a wind turbine, you have sheep grazing underneath the solar panels, and it kind of all brings everything together. So what is it? Why does it work? Why is it so beneficial? There are a few different models, and I break them down a little bit in my book just to clear up some confusion, because we're often asked, so you have solar panels on your property and then you farm underneath them. And we don't. We don't currently have solar on our property for a variety of reasons. That's not to say that we won't in the future, just at this time, we don't have any. So there are a few different models, and one of them is the idea of a farmer farming under his or her own solar. A lot of folks are doing that, and I do talk with some of them for my book if that's something you're interested in learning more about, whether that's how to finance that, whether it's what those setups kind of look like. What we do, however, is we graze land that is being leased by another farmer to a solar company, and then we are then hired by the solar company to serve as the vegetation management provider. And again, I'll talk benefits of that in a few minutes. There's also this idea that I include in the book of something that's really different from these other two models, which is simply a farmer installing renewables to power their operations in some way. I already mentioned why I use the term agri-energy. In terms of benefits, there's a lot, and I will talk about those as we move through the slides. But the biggest benefit for us is that it allowed us to finally have some sense of control and independence in how we choose to operate our farm, and the ability to operate our farm in a way we want that is not solely dependent on things like commodity prices, or local demand. Things that can be really tricky to predict and even more difficult to control when you are out there farming full time. This does not want to advance for me. There we go. Okay, so how it works. So I already mentioned there's a few different models, but our model of Agri-Energy is grazing solar sites that are leased by a farmer to a solar company. We do not, again, have solar on our own property. We are on sites that are owned by somebody else, and we are hired as a vegetation management contractor. So basically, it's pretty simple. What you see is what you get. We take our sheep, and as soon as the vegetation is tall enough for the season, which usually where we are, it's generally April, but it's very, weather dependent and how much snowpack we have on the ground. So we take our sheep and we put them on a site. Now, we're not simply just like dumping them out and letting them have free reign of the site. We have to subdivide it and make sure they are rotated throughout the entire site while they're there. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first one, and this is probably the most obvious, is we need to make sure the vegetation is staying in compliance. So, when we talk about our operation, we're sheep farmers, but when it comes to grazing solar, we really have to be service providers more than anything else. And we need to make sure that the vegetation is staying in spec with whatever it is that our contract for that site requires. And so if we were to allow our sheep to just graze an entire, say 30-acre site all at once, they're a lot like little kids, where if you put like a plate of food in front of them and it's got lollipops on it and it's got broccoli, what do you think they're going to eat first? It's not going to be the broccoli. They're going to go right for the stuff that they like and they know tastes good. And they're going to leave everything else behind. So we subdivide them into smaller areas and then move them once every 2 to 3 days. So that way we can make sure everything is getting chewed down appropriately and staying within those specs so the vegetation is not shading the panels. I get asked a lot how long we leave sheep on site, and also what our stocking densities are. So how many sheep do we need per acre? And my answer is always, how long is a piece of string? Because there are so many different variables that determine how long we are keeping animals on a certain site, and that determine how many animals we're putting out at a time. So this year, for example, was a really weird year for us. We've had a horrible drought, as I believe most of the state has. And so the vegetation growth has been really, really slow. And I'll talk a little bit later about how grazing solar has been beneficial to us this year, and how our sites look a lot different than the open pastures that some of our friends have been grazing. But for now, I'll just say we've had to move sheep quite often just because the pasture is not growing super fast. The other reason why we need to make sure we're not just dumping animals out and then leaving them there for a set period of time is really for an animal health perspective. If you leave sheep on the same site for too long, they're infested with parasites and they're just not healthy and they're not getting, adequate nutrition. So we have to be very intensive in our approach to how we manage these sites. We are generally moving them, as I said, every 2 to 3 days. Paying close attention to how well the pasture is regrowing. We also need to consider when we're, deciding how often to move animals. What does the site look like? So some sites have, may have just been built last year, or the year before, and this is the first time they've ever needed vegetation management at all. And so those generally tend to have shorter, the pasture is not growing quite as tall as it would be on sites that have been established for quite a while, or those that were established on really, really good soil, like tiled hay fields and things like that. So it's really dependent on kind of our, boots on the ground observation and being really, really diligent about paying attention to all these different factors that impact vegetation regrowth. We have to be, there's no one size fits all prescription here. We have to be very individualized in how we deal with each of these different sites. Today is not my day for Zoom. There we go. Okay, So when I first started to write my book, I wanted to focus kind of primarily on what the benefits were for the farmer, because obviously that's my perspective coming into this. This is my, little narrow slice of the world. And I really viewed when we first started doing this, I viewed solar grazing and agri-energy kind of just as a means to an end for us. I really wasn't aware of the other benefits that existed for the local community and for the environment and for the animals. And as we started doing this and I became more exposed to these ideas, I realized that they go far beyond benefits for the farmer. But I'll start here because this is where my lens is. So if I could sum up kind of the current farming environment, what it's like to be a farmer in America right now, you've probably gathered from recent news reports that it is challenging and that it is very, very sticky. There are lots of problems at play in the world of agriculture, and I could probably spend hours talking about them, but I'll try to sum them up in kind of a nutshell so I can get into the weeds, pun intended, of how agri-energy can help solve some of the problems. So, one of the biggest problems is that our farming population in the United States is rapidly aging. So, roughly a third of American farmers are over the age of 65, and the average age is 58. In 1935, for some context, we had roughly 6.8 million farms, and that was really the heyday of American agriculture. Currently, we have 1.88 million. What's really interesting about that is that the average farm size has actually increased. So it's risen from about 100 acres per farm to more than 4 times that. So there's been so much consolidation and corporatization of farms in America that small farms like ours, even though we are 98% of all farms in America, we account for a very, very small percentage of total output. Because of that, most American farmers aren't just farmers. They're doing other things as well. So more than 80% of us rely on some form of off-farm income. And a significant percentage of that, so 80% of that, are farms who are relying on more than one form of off-farm income. So for example, both husband and wife are supplementing the farm with off-farm income. And I can speak to that personally. Before we got into solar grazing, I was working 3 jobs. My husband was working 3 jobs in addition to the farm. That's a huge problem. So farming currently accounts for less than 1% of the American GDP, and a lot of that has to do with the barriers to entry. Our agricultural imports amount to 213 billion, and we have a negative trade balance, and that's been standing for the last few years. So, in my opinion, one of the biggest barriers for American farmers, we talk a lot about this idea of renewable energy jacking up land costs and making it prohibitive for farmers to farm. But really, I don't think that's what it is. I think development in general is a threat, not renewable energy, which I'll talk about later. But there's just this general blindness to what it actually takes to produce food, because the reality is that what it takes to produce food goes beyond just land access. So, can a farmer afford to farm that land, and where can we sell our products? So the argument is always, and I'm sure every single one of you has heard this, that we can't lose prime farmland to solar. But the reality is that prime farmland isn't prime farmland if there's nobody who can afford to or who wants to farm it. And that's the situation that we're currently in. Farmers aren't going out of business because renewables or any kind of developments at all are stealing their land, but really because there's no other viable path out. So the barriers that prevent farmers from staying in business long term are the same ones that prevent new farmers from getting into it. As I mentioned before, in the US, we're importing a large amount of our food supply, which we really shouldn't be doing because we're on some of the most fertile farm ground in the entire world. We have a terrifying lack of diversity on our farms. About sometime in the mid 20th century, we shifted from an agricultural system to what I call an agribusiness one, meaning we're focused on profit and yield rather than on quality and diversity. We're not focused on feeding our neighbors, we're focused on making money. And I have nothing against that. We all, we need to run a profitable business. Everybody needs to do that. Everybody should have the opportunity to put food on our table. But we're not focused on feeding our neighbors. We're focused on making money. And as our president implements these tariffs on half the world, I think those chickens are really starting to come home to roost. We're in a position where we are solely reliant on shipping our commodities to other countries. China is a huge buyer of soybeans, and they haven't bought any this fall, and that's really impacting American farmers. Um, And like I said, I'm not ignorant of the benefits of capitalism. We all need to make money, but we're wasting a huge amount of land in the U.S. on commodities that don't stay in the U.S. And for those that do, they're not contributing in a meaningful way to our everyday diets. So cattle, corn, and soy are our three top commodities. Most of our corn and soy are raised for livestock feed, ultra processed food, which is typically processed outside of the US. So there's, again, less money going back to that first, the starting point, the original farmer. And then the one you are all probably aware of, which for corn is ethanol. The biggest problem with ethanol is that it's not a super efficient biofuel. Solar produces 30 times more energy per acre than corn and 85 times more driving miles. And we have about 30 million acres of land that's solely dedicated to corn. All of our energy is procured on about 74.5 million acres, which is 3% of the land in the US. 2/3 is used to grow corn and soy. So if the country were to transition 40 million acres of ethanol fuel to solar, and ideally dual use solar like this, we could meet 100% of its electricity needs while also powering a nationwide fleet of electric vehicles. So we really need to think about how we're using our land and whether it's truly benefiting the American farmer. Because if it were, if this system of producing energy on our land was working, I could get behind it. But it's not. Corn production is at an all-time high. Our yields are better than ever, but the prices are low, and most growers are being propped up by subsidies that encourage overproduction for commodities that don't even feed us. They fuel our vehicles. So we really need to think carefully about whether it's truly prime farmland and how that farmland could be better used for something else. And the last kind of data point I'll get into there is when we talk about repurposing that land, there's always an argument that, okay, well, the way we're farming now is the way we need to farm if we're going to be able to feed the world's growing population. And that's not necessarily true. There's this idea that small regenerative farms like us can't feed the world. But based on studies, 90% of Americans could be fed entirely by food that's grown or raised within 100 miles of their homes. However, it does require a rethinking of the way we're doing business. So those are kind of some of the problems and then the solutions that Agri-Energy provides. First, and probably the most obvious, is for the farmer who wants to stop farming and finally be able to retire, there's a huge financial benefit to converting land into solar. You probably know solar and wind lease rates are significantly higher than what a landowner might receive otherwise. Most of these farmers don't have IRAs or 401ks to fall back on. Land is the asset, and it's a big one. There's also a question, people say, okay, well, if this land doesn't go into solar, it will remain farmland. And that's seldom the case. If a farmer is thinking about putting his or her land into solar, then very likely the alternative choices are putting it into housing developments or, storage facilities, or God forbid, yet another Dollar General. These projects, as you're probably aware, don't allow for farming to continue to occur at the same time. They often require selling the land outright with no continued ownership. Um, Solar, whether we like to admit it or not, is one of the few ways that farmers can generate that additional income while preserving the land for future generations, because the solar panels can be removed and the land can go back to farming later on. There's also a benefit for, what I call a generational farmer. So somebody whose family might have been on the land for decades or even centuries. And these people, they want to continue to farm. They might be young, they might have the willpower to do it, but they just can't make ends meet. And so Agri-Energy allows them to experiment and take risks on their farms that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. I actually met this summer, I spoke on a panel with a gentleman in Illinois. He's a farmer named Matt Riggs, and I believe he is a 4th generation grain farmer. And so he's farming grain on solar right now, which everybody always wants to talk about not being possible, but he is proving that that is the case. And he said that agrivoltaics is great for him because it allows him to take risks that he wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So he has that income because he has solar on his own land. So he has the income from the solar lease that he can rely on. So he can diversify more without having to worry, about losing everything in the process. And then, of course, there are the benefits for, the beginning 1st generation farmers like me. So any kind of agrivoltaics, in my opinion, is beneficial. We are sheep grazers, and sheep are often seen as like the plug and play option for solar. They are by far not the only livestock or the only crops that can be raised on solar. But one of the best parts for us is that getting into sheep from a financial perspective was much more lucrative, and there were so many fewer barriers to entry because the costs of raising sheep compared to, say, cattle are much lower, whether you're talking about the animals themselves or the handling facilities or the feed that you require for over the winter. So kind of in a nutshell, this model is great because it opens up land access so we can afford to expand our farm and not have to work, 17 jobs in the meantime. So getting next into benefits for the environment, and this was a big one. And again, I don't really think there's enough time just in this short webinar to get into all of them. And here's my plug, buy my book if you want to learn more. So I already mentioned one of the first problems of labeling prime farmland, and that being, if the farmer can't farm it, then it's not prime farmland, it's just land. The other thing that comes into play here is that you can't tell if land is prime farmland just by looking at it. So whenever I have conversations with people about renewables, they instantly turn into experts. It's super amazing. They're agriculture experts, they're soil experts, they're wildlife experts. They know everything there is to know about what makes good farmland and how to take care of that land. And I don't say that to be disparaging. And I get and I fully respect that people are concerned about different aspects of renewable development. But you really need to get the full picture. And unless you are the farmer who is working a field, or maybe you're with the soil and water department and you've just taken a sample of soil, unless you're one of those people, you really can't tell if farmland is prime farmland just by looking at it. So especially in the Midwest, we are kind of at this crossroads where our current farming practices and the practices that we've had for the last several decades are not doing much to restore the land that we are farming on. So on average, we lose about a pound of topsoil for every bushel of corn that's produced. So in the Midwest, soil is eroding up to 1,000 times faster than it's formed, and that's a huge problem. So it's requiring more and more inputs to farm the same plot of land than it ever has, which in turn results in increased costs, whether that's from an economic standpoint, environmental, or societal, because as we all know, those inputs, whether that's fertilizer or pesticide, they're not necessarily great for our health. So solar by itself doesn't really do anything to help this problem, but when you combine it with the right kind of farming, it can, and in a really big way. So solar grazing, which again is what we do with the sheep, actually helps to create new topsoil. There was one study I read that estimated that thanks to solar grazing, there's going to be a 65% increase in carbon sequestration, along with improved water retention, decreased erosion, and improved pollinator health. When conventional monoculture crops, so again, that corn and soy I mentioned earlier, when those are replaced with intensively grazed solar and sheep sites. So for the most part, the farmers who are farming on solar are following these intensive models because, again, as I discussed earlier, it makes the most sense from a vegetation management standpoint. When we dump the sheep out on solar, we can't let them have the full site because they'll be like kids in the candy store and ignore all their broccoli. So we have to move them frequently through rotational grazing. And so just moving them often and keeping an eye on the pasture regrowth serves a lot of practical benefits for us, but then it also helps improve that soil health over well. So another study has shown that after just a decade of grazing in this fashion, soil carbon levels actually return to those of native forest soils, so what they were before agriculture. And they also had decreased fertilizer and irrigation demands. And what's really interesting is that these effects are happening not just on farmland that's being developed for solar, but places like brownfields and landfills have also seen soil health improve after management in this way. One more study I will throw at you at the risk of sounding like a data spill here, but farms that practice rotational grazing like this result in 19% fewer emissions than non-practicing farms and 35% fewer for longer than 2 years. And a lot of it has to do with the accumulation of stored nutrients in the soil from improved manure management. Kind of at a bird's eye view, rotational grazing. So again, that's just the idea of putting sheep or even cattle, which is another option for solar sites under solar panels. Reduces erosion. It helps with runoff, which is big for anybody who is considering installing a solar project. We need to pay attention to how that project is dealing with rainwater after installation. And it's not just livestock either. So a lot of times, the question that I get is whether sheep are the only option that work. and they're not. So crops have kind of been the long-term go-to on these sites as well, and there are tons of benefits for them. The shade that is provided by solar panels reduces water evaporation and creates a more humid environment for the crops. And the crops can actually cool the panels through evapotranspiration and then thereby increase the panel's efficiency. So there's a really interesting kind of symbiosis that happens there between the vegetation and the panels, especially when things are managed in the right way. Which leads me to my next point. If I can get there we go. So the animals. So I've had a lot of really interesting comments come out of the woodwork in the last year or so about our sheep. So again, there's always the question of, are they goats? I actually had one person who was convinced that I was lying to them, that they are definitely goats and they are not sheep. And I'm like, all right, man, whatever you say. But they are definitely sheep. A lot of concern tends to arise about the health of the animals on the site and then thereby our health if we eat the meat from the animals produced on site. I've been asked if my sheep turn radioactive and glow in the dark. They don't, which is kind of a bummer because it would be kind of cool if they did, but they don't. I've actually been called a murderer for selling lamb to my customers and feeding it to my family because we all know that solar panels leach chemicals into the soil. And I'll admit that I do think we need more studies on, the long-term impact of solar on livestock. But what we're seeing is that the sheep that are raised on solar or whatever livestock or crop it is you're producing are some of the healthiest and happiest we've ever had. And there is data to back this up too. So anecdotally, we noticed that our lambs were a lot larger, both at weaning and then when it came to slaughter time, because we raise meat animals. They were a lot larger on solar than on traditional pastures, and they also consume less water during the growing season. The forage quality is also improved, which is a big one. A lot of people assume nothing grows under solar panels, and that's blatantly false. I think some of that has to do with maybe the old days where gravel or crushed stone was used under the panels rather than revegetating it. But in my experience, it seems to be very seldom the case. A lot of people also forget that a lot of grass species, especially in cooler climates like ours, don't like full sun. They actually prefer some shade. So the forage quality, especially when the weather is hot and dry as it has been here this summer, that is dramatically improved. The animals also have shade, which results in less stress for them and higher finishing weights, as I mentioned. They drink a lot less water too. So when we first started grazing on solar, we were on sites that had been built a few years ago. And so we weren't part of the original discussions about how we could optimize the design for livestock. Now when we have the opportunity to have those conversations, we do always mention, if we could put water on site, that's great. But back in the day being, 4 years ago, we didn't have that luxury. And so we were trying to figure out how we were going to truck water to animals that were, maybe an hour away on site. What we realized though when we got there was that it really wasn't that big of a problem because the sheep drink a shockingly low amount of water when they're grazing on solar. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that the vegetation holds water so much better under the panels. And it's still not a problem this year for us, even though we're in the middle of a drought. We have friends that graze in a traditional sense and they've been supplementing with hay all summer and we just haven't had to do that, which has been great. Outside of the sheep, or whatever livestock you're grazing, there's benefits to other types of wildlife too. So sheep can be paired with pollinator habitat very easily. You could let them loose on a site only when the plants have already flowered, and then they chew down the vegetation before it goes to seed, and then come back later in the season if there's more growth, because they don't hit everything at once like a mower might. This system really is better in general for pollinators than mowing. And in most cases, it's also an improvement over previous agricultural use of the land too. Most conventional farmers are spraying herbicides and pesticides, which we all know are not great for pollinators. Agri-energy farmers generally aren't. I won't speak for everybody, but like I said, a lot of us are following more of that regenerative model. And so if you had a field that was previously dedicated to corn and then you're transitioning it to an agri-energy solar farm, now you're doing something for pollinators. Corn is wind pollinated. It's not doing anything for the bees and butterflies. So this is a big advantage there. And then there's the wildlife question. So there tends to be a lot of concern over what happens to wildlife when you put in a solar farm. And I think those are valid concerns. But we see anecdotally, and there are also studies backing this up, that biodiversity tends to be significantly higher on solar sites that are grazed, especially if those sites have some sort of pollinator provisions taken into account. So we see on any given day on a site, we'll see ground nesting birds, we'll see, little rodents like voles, we'll see woodchucks, we'll see birds of prey. So we're not really seeing this as a concern, and the data is not showing it as being problematic either. So then the kind of the last benefit that I will get into before I wrap things up here is going to be benefits for the economy. If I can get this to advance. There we go. So there's obviously this massive benefit to the local economy. So when we first started grazing, we really loved the idea that when we're doing this, we're able to keep things truly local. So our sheep, we don't keep sheep on site year round. There are a lot of farmers who will have sheep on a solar site, 12 months out of the year. For us, that model doesn't really fit the way we operate because so many of the solar sites we graze are so far from our home farm, and we wouldn't be comfortable having animals on site throughout lambing without us there to keep an eye on them. So we don't do that personally, but that's not to say that it can't be done. Sheep are actually really good at digging through the snow and finding forage even under a few inches of snow. So it can be done. But for us in the winter, we're feeding hay. And so when we're feeding hay, the hay that we're feeding in the winter is from the farmers who leased us our very first solar farm that we still graze on. We rent barn space for lambing from them too. We use a local vet. The meat from our lambs, when they're slaughtered in the fall, is sold to local restaurants and stores. So it's all very full circle. And for the most part, the solar sites that we're grazing are actually all community solar too, which means they're feeding energy back into local homes and businesses. So the reason why this is so important to us as farmers is because rural communities tend to be some of the poorest. There's this huge irony in farming communities because they're responsible for producing food, but they have the highest rates of food insecurity. So in the last decade, national food insecurity has actually declined, but counties that are dependent on farming have seen a 12% increase. And with these federal cuts to programs like SNAP, that's unfortunately not going to get any better. So we really need to find a way for our food to stay local. And as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a lot of pushback from big ag about how, we need CAFOs and feedlots and these large commodity farms to feed the world, but it's really not the case. We just need to make better use of the land we have. And that's going to take a huge, massive upheaval of the status quo. But I think agri-energy is really the best and the most helpful first step. Which leads me to my next point, which is this idea that sheep are the only commodity that will work well on solar. And right now, it's true that sheep are very much the plug and play option. You can put them out on sites that were designed 10 years ago, and for the most part, they work quite well. And admittedly, our domestic market for lamb is small compared to beef, but we have a lot of room to grow. We imported 305 million pounds of lamb and mutton in 2024, primarily from Australia and New Zealand. And we can be doing this domestically. So why aren't we? And that's true for most of our food products. I can't think of really a single thing that couldn't be grown on solar. There are some crops, hay and corn would be an example, that need more consideration in site design. Panels might need to be elevated. We might need to pay more attention to whether we're burying wires or how big the spacing is between the rows or how much space is at the end of the alleys to allow larger equipment space to turn around, but it can and it is being done. So give me a food product and there's a slim chance that it's not at least being tried under solar right now. Just last month, I spoke with a developer who successfully installed and is running a project that's installed over a cranberry bog. So just about any crop can be grown on solar. And I haven't talked about wind at all, but wind is honestly even easier to farm under than solar. So you might see, a slight decrease in yield. But in my opinion, we really need to stop focusing solely on this idea of yield. So just because you can produce more doesn't mean you need to. And this is really what we're seeing with corn. So let's, maximize the land use by producing energy and a crop, which is something you just can't do with fossil fuels. So some of the other things that I know of that are currently being done, many of them at scale on solar, are clipped wing poultry, geese, ducks, rabbits. There are certain breeds of pigs, pasture pigs, that can be raised on solar. Pretty much any kind of crop you can think of. So whether that's brassicas like broccoli, tomatoes, greens, peaches, even cranberries, mushrooms, and then again, even your commodity crops like wheat and barley and hay. So again, you might need to modify the way a site is designed, and your yields might be a little bit smaller, but again, if you're getting a smaller yield on one crop, you're still getting that overall improved yield because you're also now harvesting energy from that same site. And when you take all these things together, you're reducing your reliance on imports and on fossil fuels, and you're allowing for a sense of food independence and a circular economy that benefits the community that it exists in rather than some large corporation or an overseas entity. So I have my contact information here. I think we already dropped it in the chat, so you should have it. But basically, my takeaway here is that we need to start having these conversations about how we're making use of our land, and we really need to do it from a human perspective rather than this us versus them thing, which unfortunately, climate change, which I guess you're not allowed to say anymore if you're in DOE. It shouldn't be political. It really needs to be this thing that it's a human problem. So we need to take a more human approach. Um, we can't be us versus them. Most people really do want their communities to be cared for, both from a food and an energy perspective. And this is the best possible way to do it. And the worst thing we can do is finger point and blame. So get out of this one track train of mind and start being more creative about how we are making use of our land and how we're working with the farmers who are ultimately responsible for it. So with that, any questions?
Thank you so very much. That was just outstanding. There was even comments in the chat that said, I'm so glad this is recorded because the information is so dense and there's so much there that we want to go back and watch it again. We have a few questions, but then we also have some other interesting things to discuss here. I just want to make sure that the link for your family farm is put into the chat, and that your information page from Island Press is also put into the chat, and that your contact information that you had on the last slide is put in the chat. So we had a few quick questions. One is about goats. Tony asked, can you graze goats and what type?
So to my knowledge, and I'm not going to say no, because I am very much the type of person that I won't say no to anything. Because if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said you can't graze cattle on solar, and you very much can. So right now, goats are not really considered a viable option for solar. And the reason for that is because goats kind of unlike any other type of livestock, they jump a lot. That's why if you're raising poultry on solar, they're generally clipped wing poultry that aren't flying up, because then they're not trying to roost on top of panels. So no, I don't believe anybody is doing goats, but I would not be surprised if somebody figures out a way to do it in the future.
Okay, and then a question from Claire. What do you think policymakers can do to help support farmers run successful agri-energy systems?
I think the more incentives we can provide, namely to developers who are kind of on the fence about implementing these systems, the better. I'm the type of person who is always very hesitant to suggest additional regulation. And the reason I say that is because there's been a lot of conversation lately about what agrivoltaics means and whether there are certain crops or livestock species that should be excluded. There's been talk in some communities of agri-energy only being an option if it is not sheep or pollinators, so having to do something else. And I think a lot of that has to do with this fear of, you get some outside sheep farmer coming in and farming land that was previously dedicated to dairy cattle or beef cattle or something like that. And it's really a lot of that outsider fear. And so I'm very hesitant to suggest any additional regulation, even honestly, regulation that aims to define what agrivoltaics means, because it is such a broad term. And I worry that any kind of piecemealing out of that at the state level and especially at the federal level could result in farmers being even more hamstrung. If you say that a site has to have agrivoltaics or it can't be built, okay, well then you're limiting that, because then what if the site just really isn't designed well for farming? What if it's in a location that's not suitable for raising sheep or for raising cattle or whatever it might be? So I think incentivization of renewable companies to pursue agrivoltaics is really smart. Regulation, however, I'm a little wary of.
In your recent LinkedIn post, you raised a question about some what about X and what about Y? And you dealt with that so tactfully. It's clear that you've been sort of fire tested by social media in lots of different ways. I would love to hear you just recap a bit of what you put in that LinkedIn post.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting because I didn't have a huge social media presence prior till like late spring of this year when my publisher, very rightfully so, was like, hey, we need to kind of start talking about these things because you have a book coming out. And so I was really pleasantly surprised at the traction that I gained on LinkedIn with people interacting with this content. And for the most part, I will say it has been overwhelmingly positive and people being supportive and asking questions. And I really love having these conversations, even if they are critical. So even if somebody's saying, well, I don't like this part of solar, I'm concerned about the view, or I'm concerned about, whatever aspect it is. And I always welcome those conversations because it presents the opportunity to provide more information. And when I wrote my book, that was my goal. Contrary to what some people on LinkedIn think, I did not write this book to get rich. If anybody thinks writing books is a is a get rich quick scheme, you might want to try farming because it's about the same level of revenue there. But I wrote it because I really do believe in this system, and I think it just needs to get to the right people. So I always welcome those conversations. Where I have to kind of stop engaging is when people get hostile. And fortunately, that's a very, very small percentage of people that I interact with. But there are some people who just want to believe what the how can I say this politely? What the federally advertised narrative is around renewables, and they don't want to dig any deeper into what the research is or what people are actually seeing on the ground. At the end of the day, all we want is for our communities to be successful, and so we need to keep an open mind to all the solutions that exist out there. I don't know if that answered your question well enough, but
Yes, yes, it did. And it really gets into the point that a lot of people who are voicing their opinions on agrivoltaics aren't farmers or landowners, you know? And so I think that's one of the reasons that your voice is so valuable. And clearly you've put so much thought into these well-structured arguments that I think we just need to get more people to listen to you. So getting your voice out there is really, really a good thing. I noticed that there are a lot of people in the audience today who are like either associated with a sort of government association, government, various levels of government, or they're like zoning planners or agriculturalists themselves. And I was hoping we could take a few minutes to spotlight each of them, and I'm sorry that we don't. So for each of you who have mentioned in the chat that your interest in this and the organization you belong to, or the zoning or planning board that you belong to, please get Rebekah's contact information and contact her directly. So I just want to thank you so very much for everything that you provided for us today for information. We're going to stop the recording now, and just a big round of thanks for everything that you've added to the conversation today.